Hello, everyone, and welcome to Research Bunny. Thank you for joining us today, where we dive into the remarkable world of academic research and uncover insights that shape our understanding of the world around us. I'm thrilled to have you along for this journey as we explore a topic that's not only timely, but profoundly impactful: trade wars and tariff policies. Now, before you start imagining rows of dusty economics textbooks, let me assure you, this discussion isn't just for economists. It's for anyone who's curious about how nations shape their relationships through the delicate dance of trade and how those moves can ripple through the global economy, affecting everything from the price of your morning coffee to international diplomacy. Let's start with an intriguing thought. Global trade is like a massive web, linking countries, industries, and consumers into an interconnected network. But what happens when a strand of that web is tugged too hard? Trade war's a term that might sound like it belongs in the realm of science fiction air. The real-world answer: when nations impose tariffs and trade restrictions to protect their own interests, they set off a chain reaction that goes far beyond borders. Today, we're discussing a groundbreaking academic paper titled Trade Wars and Tariff Policies: Long-Term Effects on Global Trade and Economic Relationships by Ejuchegahi A, Angwaomaodolo, an independent researcher whose work sheds light on the ripple effects of these economic clashes. So, why is this research worth our attention? Well, over the last decade, trade wars have taken center stage in global economics, with major players flexing their economic muscles in seemingly never-ending skirmishes. Think of the US-China trade war, for instance, a modern-day example with deep and lasting implications. We've seen tariffs on everything from steel to soybeans, disrupting industries, shifting global trade patterns, and altering economic relationships between countries. But the story doesn't stop at the immediate financial losses or gains. What's fascinating, and yes, I'll promise not to overuse, that word is the long-term impact these policies have on supply chains, investment strategies, geopolitical alignments, and even technological innovation. This paper dares to venture beyond the surface-level impacts to explore how these trade conflicts reshape the economic landscape over decades. But before diving deeper, let's address a question you might be asking. What do we really mean by trade wars and tariff policies? Imagine for a moment two countries playing an economic chess game. One country imposes tariffs, a type of tax on imported goods, and suddenly, the imports from the other country become more expensive. The affected nation, understandably upset, retaliates by imposing its own tariffs. And just like that, a tit-for-tat economic battle begins. The goal might be to create leverage, protect domestic jobs and industries, or punish the other country for some perceived wrong. But while the strategy might seem simple, its consequences are anything but. Since trade wars aren't a new phenomenon, this paper examines them through a fascinating blend of historical and contemporary lenses, providing us with a richer understanding of how economic confrontations aren't just isolated events. They're pivotal moments that shape global trade patterns for generations. To that end, Angwaomaodolo has crafted an extensive literature review as part of the research, leveraging resources from some of the most prominent academic databases like JSTOR, Scopus, and Web of Science. By reviewing studies focused on global trade conflicts, particularly the US-China trade war, this paper moves past the headlines and delivers a nuanced look at how these economic tussles play out over time. What makes this literature review particularly robust is its commitment to balance. It includes both quantitative and qualitative analyses, ensuring that we don't just look at raw numbers like trade deficits or GDP impacts, but also consider broader narratives such as shifts in geopolitical alignment or sectoral consequences in industries like agriculture. And while technological innovation isn't the first thing that comes to mind in the context of trade wars, the review reveals how these policies spur creative responses from businesses and governments, often changing the trajectory of technological progress to adapt to new trade realities. It's important to highlight that the research excludes studies published before 2010, with the exception of foundational theoretical frameworks. Why? Because trade wars are highly context-dependent, and newer studies often capture the nuances of global trade today, with its complexities of fast globalization advanced supply chains, and a rapidly changing economic landscape. By limiting the scope to the past decade and focusing heavily on peer-reviewed sources, the research maintains a level of academic rigor that ensures the findings are both reliable and relevant. Now, I'll grant you, trade wars and tariff policies may not sound like topics that keep most people awake at night. But think of it this way. Behind every trade war are stories of farmers struggling with falling crop prices, businesses scrambling to adjust their supply chains, and consumers wondering why the goods they rely on are suddenly so expensive. Behind every tariff policy are strategic decisions that ripple across industries, forcing companies to rethink their business models and nations to forge new alliances. This isn't just about abstract economic data, it's about the human stories tied to the ebb and flow of global trade. Angwaomaodolo's paper helps us explore these issues through examples that are as concrete as they are compelling. One such example involves the agricultural sector, which is disproportionately affected by trade wars. When retaliatory tariffs are imposed on goods like soybeans or pork, it's not just an economic problem, it's a livelihood issue for thousands of farmers. Similarly, when manufacturing costs soar due to new import tariffs, businesses have to make decisions that could either pass those costs along to consumers or impact their bottom line. These are choices that ultimately influence jobs, prices, and economic competitiveness. What's also notable in this research is how trade wars affect not just the countries directly involved, but also the broader web of global trade dynamics. Non-traditional players emerge as new trade partners, resulting in shifts that might seem small at first, but ripple out to reshape global economic relationships. For instance, during the US-China trade war, China turned to countries like Brazil and Argentina to satisfy its agricultural needs, permanently altering trade patterns in strategic sectors and signaling new priorities in its international relations. This brings us back to the big picture. While the idea of protecting domestic industries through tariffs might sound appealing in the short term, even politically expedient, the consequences are far-reaching and often counterproductive when viewed through the lens of global prosperity. One nation's gain can often mean another's loss, and the interconnectedness of our global economy means these losses don't stay localized. They reverberate across industries, countries, and even generations. So, as we prepare to delve further into the key findings and methodology from this extraordinary research, it's worth pondering the question, how can nations balance their desire for short-term gains with the need for long-term stability and cooperation? Hold that thought, we will be right back after a short break. Welcome back. Let's dive into the core of today's exploration, the intricacies and findings of this compelling research on trade wars and tariff policies. Now, trade wars are far more nuanced than the headlines would lead one to believe. They aren't simply about whose tariffs are bigger. Instead, they act like a ripple effect in a pond, reaching far beyond the immediate players involved. This study offers a magnifying glass to examine how these ripples change the landscapes of global trade relationships. Let's start with the first key finding, the disruptive impact of trade wars on global supply chains. You might think of a supply chain like a well-organized relay race. Each runner, or stakeholder in the chain, passes the baton to keep the whole operation moving smoothly. Now, imagine throwing hurdles onto the track. This is essentially what tariffs and trade wars do to supply chains. Manufacturers face increased costs for imported materials, which dramatically reshapes the dynamics at various levels. Production becomes costlier, trade volumes shrink, corporate profits take a hit, and ultimately, higher consumer prices emerge. And it's not just individuals feeling this pinch, it's corporations, governments, and economies as a whole. Take the US-China trade war as a specific example highlighted in the paper. The tariffs imposed raised import costs for U.S. companies reliant on Chinese goods. Let's say you're a business owner in the U.S., manufacturing electronics. Your components, which used to arrive from China at a competitive price point, are now subject to steep tariffs. What are your choices? You could pass those costs directly to your consumers, perhaps increasing the price of your gadgets, or absorb the hit and watch your profit margins dwindle. Either way, it impacts your competitiveness on the market. It's like trying to win a race after spraining your anklet. The odds are stacked against you. This then leads directly into a fascinating second consequence, an increase in financial market volatility. Think of financial markets as a thermostat for the economic mood. It adjusts based on collective uncertainty or optimism. Now, trade wars crank up this thermostat. When investors don't know whether tariffs will be raised or dropped, it forces them to hesitate. They pull back from riskier investments and take a wait-and-see approach. As uncertainty grows, stock prices undergo sharp peaks and valleys, particularly affecting companies dependent on the countries embroiled in the trade conflict. Returning to the US-China context, businesses with significant interests in Chinese manufacturing or sales experienced stock price roller coasters. This market instability doesn't merely stay confined to Wall Street, it ripples into the broader economic atmosphere, affecting business growth and long-term planning. Another striking revelation concerns sector-specific impacts, particularly in agriculture. Picture a farmer in the Midwest growing soybeans, the kind of crop heavily exported to international markets. Now, imagine that your largest customer imposes tariffs not because your soybeans are inferior in quality, but as a retaliation in a tariff war. Suddenly, soybean prices plummet, leaving farms and surrounding economies in a financial downturn. This exact scenario unfolded during the US-China trade war, with China slapping tariffs on American agricultural goods. Farmers faced reduced demand for their products, forcing them into financial distress. But here's the kicker. China responded to the trade war by turning toward other countries, such as Brazil and Argentina, to fill the supply gap. And so it wasn't merely a loss for American farmers, it was an overall paradigm shift in global agricultural trade routes. This leads us to yet another fascinating finding, the reshaping of economic relationships between countries. Trade wars are like tectonic plate shifts. They disrupt existing alignments and force countries to form new economic partnerships. When traditional trade partners falter, nations look elsewhere to plug the gaps. For instance, the paper cites China's pivot toward Brazil and Argentina for its agricultural imports. It showcased a diversification strategy, reducing its dependency on American suppliers amidst rising tariff levels. While this may have cushioned the blow for China, it effectively reshaped the trade dynamics across continents. And beyond agricultural effects, similar shifts were seen in other sectors as countries formed alliances to counterbalance risks posed by trade wars. But there's a twist. While trade wars strain bilateral relationships, and in this case, US-China relations were indeed tarnished, they also give rise to the formulation of new trade agreements and partnerships. Think of it as an unintended byproduct of conflicta scenario where countries decide to hedge their bets against economic uncertainty by exploring alternative partners. This reshaping can bring new opportunities, but it also comes at the cost of long-standing partnerships and established trade routes. This idea of diversification naturally brings us to broader economic impacts. Beyond individual countries, the paper discusses the ripple effect on global economic alignments. Supply chains aren't merely localized, they're intricately interwoven systems that transcend borders. When a supply chain in one country is disrupted, the effects are felt by multiple economies dependent on these trade flows. Whether it's manufacturing problems in one region or shortages in another, the domino effect can be dramatic. Consider how a single tariff war between two countries can ultimately lead to scarcity, layoffs, or higher prices for consumers far removed from the original conflict. Finally, the study makes an important nod toward technological innovation. While this aspect isn't as prominently discussed as the financial or agricultural impacts, trade wars inevitably spark strategic choices among multinational companies. For instance, firms might invest in innovative technologies to reduce reliance on imported components or products. Tariffs could then act as a strange kind of catalyst for technological self-sufficiency. Imagine companies automating processes, reshoring operations, or developing novel substitutes for tariffed goods all as direct responses to destabilized economic conditions. The catch, however, is that technological transitions are costly, and these investments often take time to bear fruit. In essence, this paper takes us far beyond the immediate financial implications of trade wars, urging us to consider their deeper reverberations on global partnerships, economic sectors, and innovative responses by nations and corporations alike. The findings serve as a wake-up call for policymakers, investors, and businesses to carefully evaluate not just the here and now, but also the long-term consequences of protectionist trade measures. We're going to pause here for a short break, but don't go anywhere up next. We'll wrap this conversation up with the key takeaways and some thought-provoking reflections on what the future might hold. Hang tight. Research Bunny listeners, as we come to the end of our exploration, let's take a moment to reflect on the key takeaways from this compelling research. Trade wars and tariff policies are far more than battles of commerce or simple political maneuvers. They leave deep, long-lasting imprints on global trade and economic relationships, often reshaping the very foundations of how countries interact and conduct business. From the disruption of global supply chains and increased financial market volatility to sector-specific impacts like those seen in agriculture, the long-term consequences of such policies are undeniable. We saw how the intricacies of the modern economy, interconnected as it is, are acutely sensitive to protectionist measures like tariffs. These disruptions don't just affect large corporations and governments, they touch everyday lives, whether it's through higher prices at the supermarket, uncertainty in the job market, or reduced earnings for farmers who supply the goods we all depend upon. The diversification of trade partnerships in response to trade conflicts presents an interesting dichotomy. On the one hand, it reveals the resilience of countries and businesses in seeking alternatives. On the other hand, it also underscores the importance of cooperative, stable international trade policies to prevent the endless reshuffling of relationships that destabilize the global trade order. But perhaps the discussion opens a door to even bigger questions for us to ponder. Can nations strike a better balance between protecting their industries and preserving the health of global trade? And what role should international institutions play in preventing or mitigating such conflicts? The research emphasizes that while nations might achieve short-term benefits through tariffs and trade wars, long-term sustainable prosperity hinges on collaboration and shared progress. This paper also reminds us that understanding and solving these challenges isn't just the responsibility of economists or policymakers. We, as global citizens, play a role in shaping the future by advocating for policies that align with stability and equity in trade relationships. If you want to dive deeper into the subject and explore the nuances of the research, we encourage you to check out the link to the full academic paper on the Research Bunny app. It's an invaluable resource for anyone intrigued by the interplay of economics, politics, and the global marketplace. Thank you for joining us in today's conversation. We hope this journey through trade wars and tariff policies sparks meaningful questions and insights for you. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and let's keep contributing to a global future that thrives on cooperation and mutual prosperity. Take care.